All right, good morning. How's everybody this morning?
Awesome.
All right, we're going to jump right into contract session number 4. I know most people think, wow, we're spending a lot of time on the contracts, right?
This is good. It's good.
We want to make sure we really understand what we're doing because it's very important that we represent our client's best interests. So we're going to keep this going. We started with, we ended with section number 8 last time. We are going into section number 9, which is the inspection. So here's a question. If you buy a property with 0 days due diligence, are you allowed to inspect the property?
Yes.
Absolutely. Now, what happens if you find something?
SOL.
Not necessarily. I mean, you know, at any point it's negotiable, but if the seller says no, what happens to your earnest money?
Comes away.
You don't get it, right? Because they're the ones in control at that point with the no due diligence. All right. Right to inspect property. So that's basically the first one. Your right to inspect the property is everything that allows you to get in there. Now, this is a very important sentence, and a lot of people, we usually write this into contracts. Here in the middle it says, seller shall cause all utility systems and equipment to be on so that buyer may complete all inspections. So unless otherwise stated, no matter who owns the property, the seller is responsible per the contract for turning on utilities. Be wary of addendum from banks that trump the contract that have paragraphs that say that that's not true. Okay, so just be aware of that. But in a general situation, you go in a house that's been left vacant and they've turned off the gas or the power or the water or whatever, it's their requirement that they turn it back on so that you can do an inspection. Okay? B, duty to inspect the neighborhood. This is an important one that as you are going through the contract with your client, because I know every one of you is going to go page by page through the entire contract with your client, whether it's at an initial meeting where you're explaining the contract to them or when you're actually doing your first offer on something. Which time do you think is better for you to review the contract?
Before you make an offer.
At the initial meeting, right? Like, let's do it as part of our presentation so that they know what they're really getting through. Duty to inspect the neighborhood says, basically, there might be stuff in neighborhoods that you don't like. I can't possibly know that, so as the buyer, you have to figure that out. And it goes into detail about sex offenders, and it talks basically in general about, you know, airports, cemeteries, prisons, stadiums, odor, noise, whatever.
Crime and school go together.
Crime and school are tied together. Land use, government, and transportation maps and plans. You know, so yeah, it's all kind of, it's grouped kind of interestingly, but you know, such as it is. Warranties transfer. Here, this is basically where the seller is agreeing to transfer to the buyer, closing subject to the buyer's acceptance thereof, at the buyer's expense if there is a cost associated with the transfer, any interest in any existing manufacturer's warranties, service contracts, termite treatment, bonds, and all those sorts of things. So, if there's already a termite bond in place that's transferable, and you don't write a special stip that says transfer the bond, does it transfer?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Unless contrary to the underlying contract.
Right, unless the termite bond says it can't transfer. But if it's transferable, then this warranties transfer does allow for the transfer of that warranty or bond termite.
So the warranties that we get from, oh gosh,
American Home Shield?
Yes, American Home Shield. Do they transfer too?
They are transferable, but you have to make sure that it's still in effect. And so the reason, and let's talk about the termite one in particular. Most of the time when we ask for a termite bond, we ask specifically, if you use the special step, for a 1-year termite bond from the date of closing. If you just transfer the existing one they have and they only have like 38 days left on it, what do you get? 38 days, right? So that's why we write specific language for that usually. So generally speaking, if you're really interested, even though the contract says this is what happens, If you specifically want something, it's always better to outline it specifically. Okay? Property sold as is unless this agreement is subject to due diligence. So what does that mean?
You're just getting the property the way that it is. They're not making any adjustments to it unless it's specifically outlined.
Right. They're basically saying that there's no, we're not going to be able to ask for anything. The property is what it is. It sits there, exists, and that's what it is. But if we throw a due diligence, and this is where we outline the purpose of due diligence, and this is important for, again, for your buyers to really understand and your sellers to understand. The purpose of due diligence is to determine whether or not to exercise the buyer option to proceed or not proceed with the purchase of the property. That's a very broad statement, right? It doesn't say the purpose of due diligence is to inspect the roof. It doesn't say that the purpose of due diligence is to inspect the basement. It doesn't say the purpose of due diligence is to check the survey. It doesn't, you know, I could go on and on, right?
Mm-hmm.
The purpose of due diligence is solely for the buyer, to give the buyer time to decide whether they want to exercise their option to proceed or not proceed. There is no other reason that has to be given. There's no other conversations or inspections or anything else that has to happen. Technically, your buyer could go under contract, go to the house, not ever go to the house again. And during their due diligence, they could send over termination. And the other side's going to be, why are you terminating? Well, they decided they didn't want it. Okay. Do they get their money back?
Yep.
Yes. As long as you're doing due diligence, right? If the buyer has concerns with the property, buyer may, during the due diligence period, seek to negotiate an amendment to this agreement to address such concerns. That's the tip, that the amendment to address concerns is what you use to negotiate the contract during the due diligence. The language is the same. What can you ask for an amendment to address concerns?
Anything?
To fix structural issues.
Sure. The anything is also correct. You can fix, I mean, you can ask for anything. You can change the closing dates, you can change the price, you can change the closing cost, you can change the attorney, you can change anything in the contract. So just know that. All right, notice of decision not to proceed. This is the important part. One of the important parts. Yeah, I say that a lot, right? Every paragraph we get to, this is the important part. Buyer shall have elected to exercise buyer's option to purchase the property unless prior to the end of the due diligence period, buyer notifies the seller of buyer's decision not to proceed by delivering to seller a notice of termination of this agreement. In the event buyer does not terminate this agreement prior to the end of the due diligence period, then buyer shall have accepted the property as is subject to the terms of this agreement. Buyer shall no longer have any right to terminate this agreement based upon the due diligence period. So if 2 days after the due diligence ends, your buyer decides they don't want the property anymore, can they terminate?
Yeah.
Yeah, but they lose their.
But they lose their husband. Okay? Assuming that we're just talking about due diligence, because there are other ways, obviously. This becomes an as-is contract. Okay? So as the seller's agent, as the listing agent, is it your job to remind the other side, hey, due diligence ends in, 12 hours. Are you going to get us something? No.
Doesn't.
Because it's not your client's best interest. Because your client's best interest is for them to end and there to become an as-is contract. Now, does that mean that if after the due diligence ends, there's a structural issue and the buyer comes to the seller and says, look, I know it took too long, but there's a structural issue and I'd really like you to repair it. It's going to be like $5,000 and it meets a structural issue with the house. It's not like it's something that's minor. Does that mean that the seller can't at that point say, well, obviously, if this buyer found the structural issue, I didn't know about the structural issue, next buyer's going to find that I'm going to have to fix the structural issue to sell this house, obviously. Do they agree to fix the structural issue? They might.
Depends.
If they want to, they can. Probably should. And so that's an option, okay? It doesn't mean you can't negotiate things. Just because you're outside of due diligence doesn't mean you can't make amendments to the contract and change literally anything in the contract, okay? Don't get hung up on that it has to be during due diligence. The only thing with due diligence is that the buyer's earnest money is protected. Once you're outside of that, it's we got to come to an agreement in order for it to work out. Okay? It just removes your leverage. And then, interestingly enough, they throw in this little E, repairs, here, which is, I think, a very, it seems like a very small, like it's one line, right? Very minimal impact, right?
Huge.
Huge impact. It says, repairs. All agreed upon repairs and replacements shall be performed in a good and workmanlike manner prior to closing. So even if you don't write your amendment to address concerns saying licensed professional, blah, 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 all that stuff, you just say chimney needs fixing per the inspection. This says it's got to be done in a good and workmanlike manner, which is legalese for correctly. Right? Is that pretty good? And it has to be done prior to closing. What if you're dealing with a property that there are repairs that are being done, closing is coming up, your client's rate lock is about to expire, you need to close on the 1st, not the 3rd, but the seller is saying, you know, it's going to be the 3rd before we get this fixed. What do you do?
Push out the.
Well, but then you're going to lose your rate lock.
Yeah.
So then what you can do is you can close and hold money in escrow pending the completion of repairs.
You can. Who decides that? Who decides what path you take? Because what's another path? Another path is to just close, hope the seller is honest and does it right. Risky path, obviously.
Yeah, that's
Or another path is to push out closing and lose your rate lock, or maybe penalty to keep your rate, which usually can be done.
Could you make the seller pay that?
You can ask the seller to pay the penalty because they're the one pushing it out. They might not. But who decides which path you're taking?
The client.
The buyer has to decide that, not you. Okay? I'm going to say over and over again, I think I've said it a bunch of times, we go back and review and count, but you have to remember that this is not your purchase. You are here as a professional advisor for your client, but you're not here to make the decisions for them. You're here as a consultant. Think of yourself as a professional consultant where you provide proper information and understanding and advice, but it's not your choice as to what you move forward with. It's their choice. How much risk are they willing to take? You know, for some people, they might say, well, my rate lock is, I can't afford to pay, you know, obviously I'm going to have to close, and if, you know, the lender won't let us do the escrow thing, so I'm just going to have to hope that the seller is honest and actually finishes. You know, they've started to work on this. The crew's out there. Hopefully they'll just finish it. Is that risky? Yes. Whose risk is it? Is it yours?
The buyers.
No, it's the buyer, so it's their choice.
They could also choose to terminate the contract for breach if it's
They
not
could,
done.
absolutely. Because if it's not done prior to closing, then the seller's technically in breach of contract. But if they want the house, that a lot of times is not the issue. All right, so any questions about inspection? What inspections do we have done? You notice it doesn't really list off all the inspections that we can have done, right? It just says inspect, examine, test, appraise, and survey the property. Inspect. What kind of inspect? What inspections should you have done?
You should have a home inspection done.
A standard home inspection, right? Or maybe an advanced, you know, a standard plus home inspection would be cool.
Radon,
Radon,
meth lab.
meth lab. We had an inspector in the other day that said there's a whole run on meth lab houses that you have to There's a test they can do to see if the house has ever been a meth lab, which interesting. Lead-based paint, which we're going to talk about in a second.
Termite roof.
Termite roof is part of your general home inspection.
Although you can't get a home inspector on the roof.
Very few, if any, home inspectors will actually go on a roof. They use
Right.
binoculars and they look at it. And they look at it from inside usually too. That's usually where you can really tell if there's issues. You've got some inspectors that use the little infrared cameras and look through the walls, which is kind of cool. Depends. You've got some inspectors that are better at crawling through, being more complete in their inspections than others. What other inspections can you have to
Does
the
an
property?
appraisal fall under this period, or is it some?
Technically, you're allowed to have the appraisal whenever, but if you notice, it does say appraisal in here somewhere. Too far. No, I didn't. There it is. Appraise and survey. Because technically, you don't need any contingency agreements. As long as you can get everything done during your due diligence, have the appraisal done, have the survey done, have all the inspections done. Do you need any other contingencies?
Financing.
Why?
Because it's not always up to the buyer whether or not they're going to get the financing.
Right, but if the buyer went through pre-approval and they've been through a pre-underwriting, and really the basis of the issue of going through underwriting at this point is the property appraising, and we get the appraisal done during the, say we got a 14-day due diligence, is there a reason to have another finance contingency?
No. I mean, unless it doesn't appraise for the value that it.
But if we're during due diligence, it doesn't matter. We don't need an
You
appraisal
can walk
contingency
away.
for that. We can say, hey, the property didn't appraise. We've got due diligence to walk away, so you want to reduce the price or not?
So you're good.
We don't have to do all the hoops that the appraisal contingency goes through, which we'll talk about. We can just say, right, you want to reduce the price of your house or not? If you don't, we're done. We terminate due diligence. I get my money. We walk away. Everybody's good. Okay? So consider that. I'm not necessarily saying that's the best option, but there are many situations where a clean contract with minimal contingencies is in your client's best interest. Because we can contingency it to death and throw in 15 different exhibits, and it can be as complicated as possible, or because of the way due diligence is structured, as long as it's long enough, you can just get everything done. That, by the way, comes from commercial contracts. Commercial contracts, basically, there are no other contingencies. There's an option period, basically. And during that option period, which is in commercial significantly longer than 13 or 12 or 14 days, it's usually 30 to 60 days, you do everything. You figure out how you're going to pay for it, you figure out what the property is, you do all the inspections and environmentals and all that kind of stuff. And so this is reflective of that, which is good. You had a question?
Yeah, is there a list available of all the inspections you can do?
Not necessarily, because you really got to look at what each inspector's able to do. Most of the home inspection people have a list of what they do, and so if you looked at 2 or 3, I mean, the basic things is the house, termite, radon, meth, lead-based paint.
So meth lab inspection is real.
Yeah, no, it's real.
Was that before or after Breaking Bad?
I don't know. That's a good question.
The problem are the chemicals that are used in order to manufacture the drug.
As the buyer's agent, should you ask for the period, how long?
For due diligence?
Yeah.
Well, let's say, here's the thing, is if you don't ask for any other contingencies, then you can probably ask for a longer period for due diligence, right? What's the shortest due diligence you would ever want to ask for?
7 days.
10.
14.
How about 3? About 3. Could you get away with 3?
Yes, if you have your inspector lined up and your appraiser to go out there on the day that you.
We don't necessarily have to worry about the appraiser. Let's assume that you have a finance contingency or whatever, and all you need to get done is the inspections.
If you've got it pre-arranged, yeah, you can do it.
I mean, if you know that your inspector that you use most of the time has a slot available on Monday, and we're going under contract over this weekend, and I need, 3 days. Is that good? Can I do that?
If it works for the client.
You could, but
If
why
it
would
works
you
for the
want to?
client. Good answer. Why would you want to? I don't know. There might be a situation where you're in a multiple offer situation, or you're asking for a very specific, something kind of out of the ordinary in the contract from the seller. And so to sweeten the pie and throw the risk back on you, you cut the due diligence to 3 days. Because what's their worst case scenario? They're going to get my earnest money 3 days from now if I don't get done what I need to get done, right? And what's it hurt them? They're going to be off the market for 3 days. That's minimal risk, right? So that's a negotiation tactic. It's a strategy. So it's possible it could be as little as 2 or 3 days. I've seen people put 1 day. Especially investors that have their own crews, their own contractors and folk. They're not hiring a third-party inspector. They're just going in with their crew. They'll put 1 day due diligence because they know their guy's going in tomorrow to do a full walkthrough and get it all done, and she comes back to the report or not. And then they come back with, here's the amount of money we need, or this is good, and we move forward, or we terminate.
Does the listing agent's client, every situation I've been in as a buyer, I've asked for X, and they've all come back and said X minus something. So they're, the listing people are in charge of how long the period is, right?
Well, remember, it's a negotiation, so it's up to the seller as much as it's up to the buyer as to how long the due diligence period is. Now, I would be surprised if you put 3 days on there if they actually came back and reduced that.
I would agree.
Okay, I'd like to see that. But most of the time, if you put 7 days, they're probably not going to come back and ask. I mean, 7 is probably your most common. I tend to lean towards the 14 and try to get in the 10 plus range. Sometimes we use business days, especially if we're around holiday times and coming up on a weekend, we might use business days because that helps us in our process. So we just, there's really not, it's a negotiation. So it's like saying, well, what's the price there for the, well, it depends on the house, it depends on the people, right? And so the same thing. The due diligence depends on kind of the mentality of all the parties involved, okay? And so you have to kind of balance that. Is it a good strategy to go in and ask for more than what you really want so that you can give a little away and keep something else? Probably, okay? And so, it's always a balance. It's always good to kind of have stuff in there in your first offer that you're willing to give up. So if you ask for 21-day due diligence, they're like, come on, how about 15? Okay. I really only wanted 14, but okay, I'm good with that.
But you need to, again, buyer.
And again, right,
The strategy
like you're
in
saying,
advance.
it is the buyer's choice of how they want to proceed with that. And you can advise them based on your experience of how you might do that. And of course, if the agent is someone you've worked with on the other side before, you may have experience with how they negotiate. And so you have a better ability to kind of go into that with more knowledge.
Okay, what if you're in a due diligence period? You go in and make an inspection, find something, so you got to fix that. Then where does this go? I mean, legally, in what state is this contract? Is it an extended due diligence period or what?
No, it's not usually an extended due diligence. So when you ask for something and the seller agrees to repair, that repair becomes a part of the contract. It becomes a requirement of the contract. The due diligence period comes and goes, and so it basically becomes an as-is contract, but the contract says you have to do this, this, and this. Okay, does that work?
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit about that when we actually get to the amendment to address concerns and kind of look at the actual document. We'll look at a little bit of, because there are a couple of quirks in that too that we want to go through. But that's a good question, because yeah, it doesn't, due diligence go on in perpetuity. It dies, but it doesn't mean that the seller doesn't still have to do those things. Okay? Any other questions? I mean, inspection's a pretty big deal, right?
Can you typically expect to pay, how much can your client expect to pay for inspection?
Typically, it's $300 to $400 for a basic home inspection. Radon tests tend to be, I don't know, 50 to 150, something like that. Lead-based paints are pretty cheap, I think, $50-ish. The other thing the inspector can do, just as another to add to your list, in unincorporated DeKalb, and I'm sure in other, like City of Doraville, I think as well, there are plumbing flow rate requirements, and so the inspector, as a certified inspector, can actually issue the certificate of the house meeting the low flow requirements so that the client can get their water turned on. So you want to make sure you ask for that if you're in that particular situation, that particular area.
And that's Fulton?
Or
DeKalb.
Yes. In our area, it's unincorporated DeKalb. So if you're in the city of Dunwoody, city of Brookhaven, city of Decatur, city of Chamblee, and so on inside Decatur, inside DeKalb County, then that doesn't count. But I'm pretty sure the city of Doraville has its own, so you always want to make sure that it's one of the things that you check on through due diligence.
The inspectors would know this, so right?
They should if they're good, yes. Which brings up the next question. So we have a concierge list that has a whole bunch, and we have inspectors. One of our most common guests in our office is an inspector, right? So how does the client know which inspector to use? Do you give them, I've worked with Rob for years, and he's good, and I really think you should use Rob. What do you do? The old rule was give them 3 and let them pick, right?
That's nice to do.
That works. There's also, you're advising them, so you can say, here's our concierge list. All these inspectors have been vetted out by, Coldwell Banker agents, and it's been through the process. I've worked with this one, and this one. I tend to use this. I've worked with this one the most, and they've been pretty good. But, you tell me which one you want. Now, can you coordinate the inspection? Can you order it and set it up?
No, I don't think you're supposed to.
You can,
You can't?
as long as you're being directed by the client.
Okay.
Okay? Because if they say, because that's a part of your service, if they say, yeah, go ahead and use XYZ inspectors and set them up next week whenever, they can be out there, I'm pretty open. Let me know. Okay. I'll coordinate that and let you know. Now, who signs the contract with the inspectors?
They do.
They do. Who pays the inspectors?
They do.
They do. So you gotta, you can coordinate, but you're not covering the cost and you're not signing any contracts on their behalf. Okay? We good with inspectors? Yeah. Good. That was a long section one. Okay. We're moving rapidly here. Lead-based paint. This one will be relatively quick, right? Because it's only that long. If the property was built prior to 1978, lead-based paint exhibit is hereby attached as an agreement to this exhibit. So whether you mark it in the exhibit section or not, which we'll get to, it's a part of this exhibit, or it's supposed to be. Okay? As the buyer's agent, can you fill out the lead-based paint exhibit and then send it back and have the seller fill out the rest of it?
No.
Not so much. And we're going to wait and go through exhibits in a minute, or a day, or a week, or whatever. But we'll go through the details of that. But the reality is let's talk about if it was built prior to 1978. Home was built in 1978. Does it need a lead-based paint exhibit?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so. We're pushing the line there. What about 1979?
No.
Not really. Not likely. What about 1980? No. What about 2000? No. What if, I got you, what if you go in the house and there's this huge antique built-in whatever, bar, bookshelf, desk unit, mantle, that clearly predates 1978.
Yes,
We
it's
should
You
have
have to-
checked.
Any portion.
It says any portion. You're close enough, you can read it. Any portion of a residential dwelling was built prior to 1978. So if it's obvious that there is a piece of the property that is clearly older than 1978, then there should be a lead-based paint disclosure. Now, as an agent, are you required to be able to tell if this mantle predates 1978? Not really. Now, as the seller of the property, are they required to disclose that that mantle predates 1978 if they know it?
Mhm.
Important statement, right? If they know it. Because if they didn't build the house, they bought the house, it's been 20 years, they don't remember, then are they required to disclose it? Yeah, we won't. Okay, we won't argue that. Always disclose, disclose, disclose. There is also an additional lead-based paint exhibit. There's also a brochure, right? Who do we give that brochure to?
Everybody.
Everyone. Because that way they're fully informed, they fully understand that, oh, this cool house that was here but has all this antique stuff built into it, maybe I should have that checked out. And now they're educated and it's their decision on whether they're going to do that or not, whether it's just an exhibit or not. Okay?
CYA.
Exactly. All right, agency. What's the best way to make sure that you've done agency disclosure?
It's in the agency thing that's in our pre-package.
The
already.
package includes in GAR, there's an ABCs of agency. I think you should give that to everyone, buyers, sellers, clients, customers, whoever. You should just carry them around by the dozen so you can pass them out like business cards, because that way you can make sure that they understand your role as an agent and their role as a client or not, and how agency works in the state of Georgia or wherever you have it. Okay? Agency disclosure in this agreement, the term broker means a licensed real estate broker, brokerage firm, and blah, blah, we're not going to read this whole section. Because basically, so there's no agency relationship. And remember, this comes off the first page. We're corresponding to section 11 here. So we have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's go back to that. So no agency relationship means that their broker's role is limited to performing ministerial acts for the party. Consent to dual agency. This is where it talks about what is required as consent as dual agency, and it very clearly states that as a dual agent, you're representing both parties. And it says buyer and seller do not have to consent to dual agency. And the consent of the buyer and seller to dual agency has been given voluntarily. You can't force people. I mean, just because both parties are your client doesn't mean you can force them into a dual agency situation. You might have to step out of one, right?
Is that the same in every state or?
No.
No. Okay.
No, the agency is very state specific.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, some states don't even have buyer's agency at all.
Okay.
So it's very state specific.
Because I was wondering if some states require their clients to sign the dual agency disclosure.
Well, here we do require that they have that we've disclosed it, and as a dual agency, that we're two clients whose interests are, or at times could be, different or even adverse. I mean, I think if this is my opinion, if somebody reads this first line, as a dual agent, brokers representing two clients whose interests are, or at times could be different or even adverse, would you want to have someone be your dual agent?
No.
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 I wouldn't want that, but I ran into that problem. I did an outgoing referral,
Mhm.
and this was in New Jersey, but for a listing. But the agent did not want to take the listing unless the person signed that dual agency was okay.
And that's state specific. In Georgia, we don't really do that. You could, but we as a company don't. We don't like dual agency at all.
Force somebody to,
Right. And it does say very clearly here, voluntarily. So it has to be voluntarily. Now, you can say, that agent may have said, well, if you won't do this, then you have to work with someone else. Okay. That's a choice. I think dual agency is very risky from a liability standpoint because you're really putting yourself on the line in representing both parties and trying to create harmony where you're supposed to be representing each individual's best interest, and it's not possible to, quote, win in that situation except for you as the agent. And that's my opinion. Now, you can approach it as a mediator and make everybody happy and smile, but that doesn't necessarily get us to where we need to be.
Okay, so to be clear, dual agency in Georgia
Is
is
legal.
legal, but you don't want to do it.
Correct. It is perfectly legal with the proper disclosures and everything, but it's not a great idea if you can avoid it.
No,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So technically, though, if it's a Coldwell Banker listing and a Coldwell Banker buyer, that technically can be considered a dual agency.
It's not,
But
because we have this thing called designated agency. So let's talk about that real quick. So designated agency, the difference is this. We all work under one qualifying broker, right? That qualifying broker is technically who every one of your clients signs an agreement with because they're the qualifying broker. So if you disappear off the face of the earth, the aliens come and abduct you, they still have a contract with Coldwell Banker as their broker to represent them. The difference in designated agency is that if buyer is working with agent from, say, Office A, and seller is working with agent from Office B, then they're very far removed, right? And so really, in reality, they're really getting individual representation. Technically, they fall under the same broker, but getting personalized, non-conflicting individual advisement. Okay? Now, that can also happen in the same office. Okay? It's not as distant as it is in different offices, because obviously people in the same office, you guys all have a much closer relationship with each other than you do with agents from other offices, typically anyway. So that makes it a little bit more interesting. But it's still, you have two different individuals that if you uphold your ethics and keep the way you're supposed to be, there won't be any crossover, any issues where one party's interests are subverted for another party's. Okay? And so really, I don't have an issue with designated agency. I think that's fine, because you have a personal advocate fighting for you. When that starts to get a little funky, though, I will tell you from my experience, is in the past we've had it in the same office, and then conflict arises. As the managing broker, what's my job?
Really, you're right.
Be impartial.
To be impartial, but when conflict arises, I tend to get called into the situation, right? When troubles exist in a transaction, I tend to get called into the transaction. And if I'm called into the transaction, I now am one person with two parties' interest. So even though they're getting individual advice from their agents, if I've been called into the transaction, I know too much. And so I have to be very careful about what I tell to who about the situation and how I handle that, because I don't want to break our privacy agreements with either party, but I have to make sure that I help whichever party needs help in a way that I would normally help them without violating the help of the other side. Okay?
But there are other managing brokers in the company.
There are, which is why it's much easier if there's designated agent office A, designated agent office B, because automatically you have two brokers and two separate, there's kind of a wall of distance between you that keeps that from happening. If you're in the same office, it does get a little bit harder. But to Rob's point, if we do get into that situation and it's really bad, I mean, the ones I've experienced have not really been that big of an issue. But if it did go to a point where this was a big issue, I could, or one of the agents could say, okay, let's get another broker involved, and we could pull in a broker from another office that would cover it up, or we could pull Charlotte in, or however we needed to do it to make sure that we kept separation. Okay? And so we just have to be very aware of those sort of situations.
If you do have two offices involved, how do you decide which broker is going to handle the conflict?
Well, that's the thing, is the broker handles each side. So just like whether it's two Coldwell Banker offices or Coldwell Banker and somebody else, as your broker, I'm going to handle your side of it. Okay. And so that's just the way we go through that. All right. So very important that you do the dual agency disclosure and the designated agency disclosure and all of that. Brokerage, this talks about the sellers agree to pay the listing broker, and how listing agent or listing broker is off, saying that they're willing to split, and the closing attorney is authorized direct pay to the brokers, and if the sale is insufficient funds and owing the same, blah, blah, blah. And then there's a disclaimer. This is one of my favorite paragraphs in the whole contract. I've been talking a lot about how we're consultants and advisors, right? Get ready to retract all of that. Because this says, buyer and seller have not relied on any advice or representations of brokers other than what is included in this agreement. Brokers shall have no duty to advise buyer and seller on any matter relating to the property which could have been revealed through a survey, title search, official wood infestation report, inspection by a professional home inspector or construction expert, utility bill review, an appraisal inspection by an environmental engineering inspector, consulting governmental officials, or a review of this agreement and transaction by an attorney, financial planner, mortgage consultant, or tax planner. Buyer and seller should seek independent expert advice regarding any matter of concern to them relative to the property and this agreement.
Thank you, Gar.
Right? I mean, you've just been relieved of all of your duties. It's true. And you do need to understand this paragraph's in there for a reason. If they start asking you about tax consequences, and you happen to know from your experience this is how it worked for you, should you share that with them?
No.
No.
Because how do you know what their experience is going to be, right? Are you a CPA?
No.
I hope not. Because this is real estate. Now, you can be a CPA and do that somewhere else, but you wouldn't want to cross that over. Okay?
You wouldn't want to deal with.
You would never want to bring up. It's just like any other. If you were any of these other. So, for instance, I'll give you my history, right? I have a degree in mechanical engineering, so I pretty much understand the structure and inner working systems of a house better than the average bear because I've been trained in it. But as an agent, would I have ever said to someone, this system is not designed properly, it doesn't have the right flow configuration?
Oh.
No way. Now, could I leverage my knowledge as a listing agent when an inspector came back and said, this system is not designed correctly and the flow is not the right way, or they tried to use some kind of jargon that most people wouldn't understand, could I leverage it there?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because I can say, okay, you need to prove that in this way because I know that what you're saying is not correct. Now, that being said, does the buyer have to listen to what I say? If I'm the listing agent? No. It's their choice. So I'm just defending my client as the seller at that point against erroneous inspection issues.
Okay, to take the simplest example for me anyway, if somebody has a question about mortgage rates or otherwise, I really ought to refer them to the mortgage analyst.
Correct.
Yeah, you know where a mortgage at.
Yeah, I mean, in mortgages, you say the simplest. It's not. It's one of the more complicated because it changes constantly. And so if they say, well, you know, how's this going to affect my credit? Well, I don't know. You know what? That's a really good question, and I'm glad that you're paying attention to that. Let's get Lisa on the phone and get her to answer that for you. And it's as simple as that. And if you set the expectation that you're an expert in what you do, and you have a team of experts to handle all this other stuff available at your discretion, then you can, you know, pull them together at any moment. Your client's not going to freak out when you say, I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. Why don't we reach out to the attorney that I work with to make sure that we understand exactly what we're doing here? Because you're not supposed to be the expert on everything. One of the biggest things you can be is a resource for experts. You don't have to be the expert. Be the resource for experts. As long as you can get the answer to the question, then you're good. Right?
So basically, he should leave his lawyer hat off,
All the time.
and he should just have his real estate hat on,
Absolutely.
right?
Anybody that has, well, it's like, you know, I mean, like I said, for me, it's engineering. You know, whatever your other professional ratings or skills or certifications or whatever are, you know, we have people that have appraisal certificates, but they would never appraise a property for a client because that would be conflict.
Conflict of interest.
So, but are they definitely positioned better to understand an appraisal coming in on one of their listings and making sure that it's not erroneous than somebody that's not?
Sure.
Yes, just because they have that skill set. Now, can they officially say this appraisal is wrong? No. So they have to be careful about that. All right, so let's do real quick. Let's get this last section, number 12, because that's actually covered everything off the first page. These are the corresponding. Remember the corresponding paragraphs to the first page? Time limit of offer. Time limit of offer shall be the date and time referenced herein when the offer expires, unless prior to that date and time both of the following have occurred. The offer has been accepted by the party to whom the offer was made, and notice of acceptance of the offer has been delivered to the party who made the offer. It's going to take us a couple minutes, okay? I want to make sure you understand this. This is the number one thing I see in auditing files that is done erroneously, okay? This relates to binding agreement date. There are two statements here under the time limit. The time limit of the offer shall be the date and time referenced herein when the offer expires, unless prior to that date and time both of the following have happened. Not just one, but both of these things have to happen. The first one is pretty obvious. It's the offer has been accepted by the party to whom the offer was made. So if I make an offer to Merrill, and Merrill accepts the offer and tells me, hey, I accepted the offer, that's A. Am I good?
No.
Because I need one more thing.
Delivery.
I need notice of acceptance of the offer has been delivered to the party who made the offer. Which in this case is me saying back to Merrill, I got it, we're good. Okay?
It should be written in written form, though.
It should.
Next paragraph.
We're going to talk all about that next time. But in this case, we're just simply understand. If your clients are accepting an offer, can you fill in binding agreement date? No, because binding agreement date is part B. It's the notice of acceptance of the offer that the offer has been delivered to the party who made the offer. So inherently, it has to be filled in by the party that made the offer, not the party that accepted the offer.
So in e-sign, I'm just trying to make sure that I understand using our e-sign tool.
Okay.
So I'm representing,
You represent a buyer,
I represent a buyer and you represent.
and I represent a seller, and you write a contract.
Right. I
Okay.
send it to you.
You send it to me,
You counter it
and I counter it,
and you send it back.
and I send it back to you.
My client says, yes,
They
You-
accept it.
I'm making a change. Then I send it back to you.
Now, did you say making a change?
They counter the
So they counter. Okay.
Counter of the
So now
counter.
they've countered back to me. So who's the offerer and who's the offeree?
So I am
Counter.
the offerer.
Offerer.
The counter
And you
counter.
are the offeree.
Okay. So then my job is to accept the counter or counter back, right?
Right. So you accept.
So I accept the counter.
Okay.
Can I fill in binding?
No.
Because
I have to.
I accepted, therefore I cannot bind.
So it comes back to.
Let me give you the history of why this is the way
This is so
it is.
confusing.
Okay? It's not confusing if you understand where it comes from. Okay? There used to be, and I'll give you a little history, our contracts used to have an acceptance date, and that was it. So when you accepted the contract, if I accepted the contract, I would write the date on there that I accepted the contract. Now, let's say that it's a Friday late afternoon, and I accept the contract at, 6 o'clock on a Friday night.
Mhm.
I don't bother to send it back to you or tell you until Monday morning. And you have a 10-day due diligence period that pins off of that date, which is Friday. What happened to your due diligence? Is it 10
You
days?
just lost 2
No, you just lost 3 days. Okay? Or 2 days, whatever.
Saturday, Sunday.
Maybe it's a long weekend. Then you've lost that time. So the reason for binding is that the party that's receiving the acceptance doesn't know the contract is moving forward unless they have received that acceptance, right? And so in order to acknowledge that they've received that acceptance, that's where binding agreement came in. Because now, if I accept it on Friday night,
Mhm.
and I don't send it back to you until Monday, you acknowledge acceptance on Monday, binding is now Monday, your 10 days starts on Monday, not Friday, right?
Mhm.
So that is in honest, fair, honestly, it's fair for all parties because now everybody's playing off the same playbook instead of being able to hold it back and kind of affect the contract that way.
So your due diligence period starts on that day. Is that what you're saying?
Well, all of your contingencies in this contract start on the binding agreement date.
Okay.
And the binding agreement date is, by definition, the acknowledgement of the acceptance.
The acceptance. And then
Not the acceptance, but the acknowledgement of the acceptance.
Yeah, okay.
Acknowledgement of receipt of acceptance.
So if you're sending out an offer, you don't send it out with a signature of the offeror. You're sending it out waiting for the offeree to sign it. Then you sign. Then your client, as the offeror, signs it, and then puts the binding date to it.
No. Because at that point, you don't have an accepted contract because you hadn't signed it yet. So if you were to send a contract to the other party and have them sign it first, then technically you're accepting the contract, and therefore they need to do the acknowledgement of the acceptance, which would be the binding. That would be strange. Don't do that. Now, there are situations where that might be necessary because your client, especially with the countering system, countering back and forth,
Right.
you guys have reached somewhat maybe a verbal agreement, which is risky, but let's say you've done that, and your clients happen to be unavailable to reach any form of signing, whether it's e-sign or otherwise. To expedite things, we get the seller to go ahead and sign it, or the other party to go ahead and sign it, and then it comes back to us, and by then we'll be able to get to it and sign it. We could do that, but again, the last party signing is accepting, and therefore the first party signing needs to be the one doing the binding. The easy way to remember it on the GAR contracts, think about it this way. At the bottom of every GAR contract is your name, right? When you type up the offer, the bottom of the signature page, it has your name on it. 99% of the time, the person's name who is at the bottom of the contract should be the one doing the binding.
Wow, we should have known that on my transaction. Because I was representing the buyer, I wrote the offer, the listing agent and seller. They countered, we countered back. They got it back, and she's been in the business for 31 years.
So she just did
And
acceptance.
she accepted it and filled it in at the bottom.
And the
signed it,
most
and sent it back to me.
common mistake
10 minutes
is that
before the cutoff, she put, we had a drop dead date of 9 p.m. and she put in 8:50 p.m. and filled it all in and sent it back to
So
me.
here's a question.
And I didn't know any different.
I didn't,
at the
I
time. Now
didn't
do.
know about this one, but did you receive it prior to 9 o'clock p.m.?
Yeah, well, she emailed it to me prior to 9 o'clock.
Okay, so we're going to wait to go into that conversation because that's in the next section.
And I saw
And that's
it.
a very important conversation. But did you see it before 9 o'clock?
No, I saw it at like 9:07.
Technically, it's not a valid contract.
Wow.
Because
I'm just
these
on
two things didn't happen, correct?
Right. It
So
wasn't delivered,
technically,
yeah. She should have called
it
me.
was a dead contract. Now again, let's remember, if both parties wish to proceed forward, then we can proceed forward at any time, no matter what's really happening with the contract, as long as all parties agree. Okay, I had one this morning on the way in. So buyer, we had a listing, buyer sent in a termination, and then called the next day to ask what their response was to the due diligence. And the listing agent said, there is no response to due diligence. You terminated the contract. We're going back active. And they said, well, but what if, would you be willing to do this? And so the question was, do we have to write a whole new contract? Or can we do something to get rid of this termination? What's the question? What's the answer?
I think you
Contract.
can,
Gotta do a
you can
new
extend
contract.
it. With both parties agreeing, you can extend it.
New
So-
contract.
A new contract is the cleanest way to do it. But if you do an amendment to address concerns that says previously delivered termination is no longer valid, is void, and all parties sign it, what happens to that previous termination?
It's
Goes away.
It's withdrawn. So you can go. You can move forward.
Good to go.
And so it just depends on the situation, the parties, and all that kind of thing as to how you want to proceed. As long as all parties are in written agreement that we're moving forward, we can undo almost anything.
See,
Okay, lawyer. Yeah.
I'm so glad we covered this because my understanding, my thinking process was, when the counter offers go back and forth, and whoever agrees with the final counter would be the person that would say, okay, we agree, and they'd bind it.
No.
But see, now,
Because the definition of binding is acknowledgement of receipt of acceptance. You have to remember, and see, and that's where, and that's why I tell you the history. The history is that we used to have acceptance. Then for a little while we had acceptance date and a binding date, which really confused people. And now we just have a binding date. And so that also confuses people because they think that that's the acceptance date, but it's not.
so you'd have
The
to.
acceptance date doesn't matter.
So in my situation, I basically just have to get a verbal acceptance from the listing agent.
No.
No, you gotta
You have to get written.
Well, written email.
Correct. So you get a written
That's it.
acceptance,
That would be
and then
written
when you
acceptance.
receive it, you say, okay,
Okay, let's
I got it
sign it.
binding, and you can, and we'll talk about this, but you can either fill out the binding on there and send the whole package back, or you can use the notice of binding, binding agreement date,
Well,
which is much better.
Which is much
Well,
better, yeah.
what you said about the clock starting, I think is what is helping me understand it because I get it. I mean, like, if you watch Property Brothers, okay, and they say, do you accept the offer? I accept the offer. And he says, you bought a house. But technically, they haven't bought a house because now he's got to call somebody up and send them an email and send them a letter or whatever and say, they bought your house, okay. And then those people know it's on. Okay, and once
And
it's
keeping
on, the clock starts.
Although they work in Atlanta too, so you have to watch their language a little bit because they're not originally from Atlanta, so their contract language is sometimes a little bit quirky.
But the clock starts.
The clock starts when everybody knows that the clock is starting. Think about it as a race,
It
okay?
makes sense. It makes sense.
Think about it as a race. If all the racers had little earbuds in their ears, and you only told 3 out of the 6 go, and the others had to wait until they were told to go, who's going to lose?
Runner beware.
The runner, right? Runner beware. The runners that didn't get told, right? So it's not fair in a race situation to only tell part of the contestants that it's time to go. You have to tell everybody at the same time. So that's why we have to have this acknowledgement. We have to have this binding to allow everybody to know that we are moving forward with the contract now. Okay?
So in my situation, that listing agent should have emailed me a little note saying, we hereby accept all the terms and
No, they should just
Agree.
sign the contract and send it back to you.
sign the counteroffer.
Or we'll counter offer. Right. Sign it and
That's the
send
other
it back
thing
to
that's
you.
weird because
And we'll get when we get to signature
yeah, see,
pages,
that's
let's
the
get to
problem
that
with
because that is a
going from
very important
state to state. This
very
is
important
why
thing.
I'm here.
All right, I'm going to come around and shut this off, but this, as you can tell, this is important that we got to keep doing this, and we got to know what we're talking about to make sure that we're representing our clients well. We'll see you next week when we do section number 5.